Michael, first off, thank you so much for taking the time joining. I know we're all coming from home, so any dog barks or kid interruptions, forgive us.
Exactly. John, it's great to be with you, and it's great to be with everybody on the conference. Thanks.
Excellent. Absolutely. So I'm sure this is going to be the fastest 30 minutes in history, Michael. But let's get into it. I'm sure a lot of folks are very familiar with you. You're obviously on CBS News a lot, post CIA career. But I guess one of the first questions I wanted to ask is, from the time you first started your career to when you left as the acting director through the Bin Laden raid and through the war on terror and everything, it's almost 40 years, I think. You had a pretty long, many decades in that career. How's the world changed? How's the security environment evolved since when you first started?
John, that's a great question. And, when I started in 1980, so the first chunk of my career, the agency was in the country, right? The country, the national security community, DOD, State Department, the agency, everybody was focused on the Cold War, right? That's where all the resources were. And then the Cold War comes to an end, and it looks like the world is a much safer place, right? From sort of 1990 to September of 2001. And that was a false thing, right? The world was actually becoming more and more complicated as we went along. And then 9/11 happens, and we find ourselves, with a new intense focus, but in a world that was much, much more complicated than it was during the Cold War. So I would tell you that two things. One is, if you're the president today, the number of national security issues that you have on your front burner, right, that you have to pay attention to, that you have to be on top of, has never been greater than at any time in our history. Going all the way back to the founding of the country. There's been more dangerous times, but there's never been a time when the number of national security issues has been greater than they are today. So that's kind of point one. Point two is that for many of those issues, they are first and foremost intelligence issues. What does that mean? It means you can't understand the issue. It means you can't make policy with regard to the issue, and it means you can't carry out that policy without first-rate intelligence. Right? I can go to almost any university and grab a really smart expert who can give me real insight on Chinese foreign policy, but I can't do that for the Iranian nuclear program, right? Or Chinese military modernization, or North Korea's long-range missile program, or the plans, intentions of ISIS in Afghanistan, right? I need intelligence, right, to give me real insight on that. So I don't believe we've had a time, if you put together the number of issues and how important intelligence is, I don't think we've had a time where intelligence has been more important than it is now. This is the golden age, right? If CIA were a for-profit company, you would invest in it. Business is that good.
Right. Yeah, Michael, I couldn't agree more. There's so many takeaways from kind of big picture national security that distills right down to cyber defense, right? Intel on tactics, techniques bad guys are using, it's really quite similar. One of the things I know we've chatted about, privately, is really what we're kind of seeing is an increase in authoritarian styles of government around the world, right? This is kind of, post-Cold War, we saw a bit of a lull. We had a lot of fractured, kind of terrorist groups, emerge. But what do you think has led to this resurgence in authoritarianism? And you could see this anywhere from, Hungary is kind of trending that way a little bit. You have China, Russia, that's kind of obvious. What do you think has led to this? And really a follow-on to that, in our current style of democracy, how do you think the modern speed and method of communications play in the hands of these style countries, right? From a IO standpoint, maybe it's a cyber disruption, information theft. Just kind of give me your thoughts on that.
So two different questions there, right? The first one on authoritarianism, it's really funny because after the Cold War ends, Francis Fukuyama writes this piece, right, called The End of History. And it basically argued that we now know we now know what the best economic system is, and we now know what the best political system is, and it's capitalism and it's democracy, and that debate is over, right? And the world is heading towards democracy, and it did for a while, right? There was a significant trend toward democracy. There was a moment when we really believed that Russia had a chance to become a democratic system. But I'd say, you know, kind of late 90s, early 2000s, the trend kind of reversed and turned around and started heading in the other direction. And, you know, we've lost a number of democracies in the world. A number of authoritarian states have strengthened themselves. I believe that this coronavirus crisis is going to strengthen that tendency. And I think it's been driven by a couple of things. Sad to say. One is our failures as a country in a couple regards. One is the decision to invade Iraq in 2003, I think, was seen by the world as a huge mistake. We can, you know, debate whether that's the case or not. Don't want to get into that, but was certainly seen by the world as a huge mistake. And who brought that on? The world's largest democracy. So people started questioning, you know, look at that. Look at that mistake that democracy made. The financial crisis added to that in 2008, where the world looked at us and said, right, this country couldn't handle one of its main responsibilities, which is the health of the global economy. And again, you know, a democracy fails at something so fundamental. And then people look at kind of the failure of our politics the last, I'm not going to say just the last 3 years, but I'd say the last 10 years, right? The failure of our politicians to come together, make compromises that move our society and our economy forward and our national security forward, right? We're missing that. And people look at that and say, wow, that's not a very effective system. Then they got another example, right? They look at China, and they look at China's rapid growth. And they look at social stability in China. And they look at the millions and millions of people who have been brought out of poverty over the last 20 years in China. And they say, hey, that system worked pretty well. You know, are there costs to privacy and civil liberties? Absolutely. But, you know, there seems to be a payoff too. So I think it's in that kind of a world that this shift is allowed to take place, where publics are open to it and authoritarians take advantage of that openness. And why is the current situation going to add to that? Because there's a perception out there, John, and I don't think the perception is accurate, but it's absolutely out there that authoritarian governments have been better able to deal with the virus than have democracies. And again, I don't think it's true. When I look at the difference between countries that have done well versus those that haven't done well, it's not a democracy authoritarian breakdown. It is a who has the best public health split. It's a cultural split between the Confucianism of East Asia and the individualism of the West. It's who's locked down their entire country as opposed to just parts of it. So it's not a democracy authoritarian thing, but man, that perception is out there. The Chinese are feeding it every day. So I really fear that the current situation is going to give a kick in the rear of the authoritarians. You know, asked about technology. I'm sure you would agree with this, but in my experience, every single piece of technology we have ever developed in the history of mankind has been used for good and has been used for bad, right?
Right.
You know, you gotta maximize its uses for good, and you gotta find ways to mitigate the people who want to misuse it, the people who want to use it against other people. And I think that the digital age, right, is a crystal clear example of that, where the internet, right, and all the things we do on it, you know, are a huge positive for society, and yet it opens up all sorts of vulnerabilities, right? Whether they be cyber, right, which is what you're focused on, or whether they be the kind of a propaganda attacks that, We saw from Russia first in its near abroad, and then in Western Europe, and then in the United States, and they've never really stopped. And now the Chinese are doing it with an aggressiveness that we've never seen before, and we haven't figured out how to mitigate that yet, right? We just haven't thought through it, in part because the politics here are so messed up that we haven't had an opportunity to think about it in a nonpartisan way. But I think it's a function of technology, and the key is, staying ahead of and mitigating the downside risks.
Right. Yeah. Without question. I mean, a perfect example, what you talk about kind of in our cybersecurity world, is we look at pen testing tools. They're open source. They're for white hat hackers. I can tell you, in most every attack we see every week, whether it's nation state or not, they're using open source pen testing tools in a lot of this, right? Done for good, also used for bad. I think one of the big challenges I've noticed is the sheer volume of communications and paths, especially for kind of a manipulative message, whether that be pushing the Russians were pushing the anti-vaxxing movement pretty hard. With their intelligence services, the election thing has been beat to death. It's been something, it's just that from a technical standpoint, it's challenging with the volume. So, over the arc of your career you've lived through, you've navigated and, engaged with Moscow, and I'm sure China at a lot of different levels. What's your assessment of the current relationship when it comes to kind of cyber operations, IO, manipulating this, taking our open society and using it against us? I definitely see, Moscow and China definitely push that. What's your assessment of the current relationship? And, if you had your choice, what are some things we can do to make it better moving forward?
Yeah, so I think about the two relationships very differently.
Okay.
So Russia, right? Russia knows it can't compete with us by making itself stronger, right? It knows how weak it is from an economic perspective, how weak it is from a demographic perspective, right? Time is not on their side. So what they choose to do in competition with us is to do whatever they can to weaken us, right? And they do that wherever they can in the world, including here in the United States itself, through the propaganda machine that we have seen. They do it in places like Afghanistan, right? They actually give support to the Taliban, and you would say, well, why would Russia, right? Why would the Russians give support to an Islamic extremist organization that at the end of the day, they're just afraid of as we are? And the answer is to make our lives more difficult, right? That's that simple. So they try everything they can do to weaken us, right? And we have not found the appropriate mechanism to deter Vladimir Putin from pursuing those kinds of policies. And, in my view, sanctioning individual entities and individual people for the kind of activity that we see around the world doesn't work. If we really wanted to get his attention, we would sanction the economy broadly, because the one thing that he is concerned about is an Arab Spring style or a color revolution in the streets of Moscow. So to really get his attention, you have to make his middle class pay a price. So that's Russia. I worry about Russia, but I worry about China a heck of a lot more, because China is playing just the opposite game, right? China is doing everything they can to strengthen themselves, right, relative to us. And that's where their focus is. So that makes them a lot more difficult to deal with. I don't think our relationship is in a healthy place. I'll tell you that I think that the relationship between Washington and Beijing is the single most important relationship in the world for what the world is going to look like over the next 5, 10, 15, 25, even 50 years, in terms of how the international economy works, in terms of who wins, who loses, and in terms of how national security works. That relationship is absolutely critical. And it's critical because the spectrum of possible outcomes in that relationship is so huge. So at one end of the spectrum, you've got cooperation, the kind of cooperation you saw between President Obama and Xi Jinping the last year of the Obama administration on climate change, right? And then you move a little further on that spectrum and you have what I would call healthy competition, right? Where firms are competing against firms on a fair playing field, where we're competing against China for influence in the world in a way consistent with the international order that was put in place after World War II. Then you kind of move a little further to the right and you've got what I would call unhealthy competition, right? Which is kind of where we are right now, where China is subsidizing its industries, where China is stealing intellectual property, where China is forcing technology out of the hands of American corporations. And where we're starting to play too, which is, denying them access to investments in our markets and things like that. And then all the way to the other end of the spectrum, conflict, war. I'm not predicting it, but the probability of war between the United States and China over the next 25 years is not zero. It is absolutely not zero. So where we end up on that spectrum matters significantly, right, for what the world is going to look like. And there are three really huge problems that are taking us in the wrong direction on that spectrum. One is the unhealthy economic competition between the two countries, and the fact that both national security communities in both countries feel too dependent on the other's economy, and this desire to separate, right? This desire to decouple, that's the word you hear. So that's one dynamic. The other dynamic is the military dynamic. We both have large militaries on the same place on the planet. And because of that, we have to plan for war against each other. We have to equip ourselves for war against each other. And we have to exercise those plans and those weapon systems, right, that we're buying. And guess what? Each side sees the other side doing that, and it creates a natural tension in the relationship. And then you get to the third dynamic, which is even harder than the first two, which is they're the rising power, we're the status quo power. Because they're the rising power, they want a greater say in the world around them. And guess who has that say today? We do, and we don't want to give it up. How does that fundamental problem get resolved? So three things taking us in the wrong direction. I think it's going to take statesmen in both Washington and Beijing at the same time, right, for this relationship to come out right. And that's going to be a very tall order, right, from a probability perspective.
I couldn't agree more. The statesmanship piece is huge. Ultimately, at the end of the day, that's how superpowers in any situation, can peacefully coexist. You touched on something that was really interesting, which is kind of this economic interdependence that both countries have, right? They hold a huge amount of our debt, and we get tons of products from them. The one thing that's kind of popped out to me is, especially, I think it was highlighted even more during this crisis, is our reliance from a supply chain standpoint. We are a very global kind of, connected world these days, hence the reason our viruses spread so quick. One thing, the MSP community, I think, can appreciate is, right after this kind of lockdown started happening, really a couple of weeks ago in various states, you couldn't get a webcam, you couldn't get headsets and microphones, usually all this stuff made in China. I believe somewhere around 60% of our generic medicine comes from China, right? So do you foresee, and what would you kind of pursue, if you were king for a day, any changes of diversification in our supply chain? Because if I think about it, it's like we come up with the next iPhone chip design, we send it over there to get produced, right? We come up with a new networking equipment design, we send it over there to get produced. So one, they own the rare earth minerals kind of market. Two, they own the production of our gear, which opens the door for intellectual property theft. And then lastly, when we talk about kind of communications infrastructure, we got the whole Huawei thing, which controls kind of distribution of comms. Big picture, what do you think the United States needs to do specifically on the technology front to reduce our dependence on them?
It's a great question. And I talked about this concept of decoupling. Prior to the coronavirus crisis, there was a view in both national security communities, the one here and the one in Beijing, that each country was too reliant on the other. So if you were in Beijing, in their national security community, you looked at China's overall growth and you said, whoa, that's too dependent on trade with the United States. Right. And boy, the last 3 years of tariffs have really driven that that point home to us, right? So we want to diversify, right, where our exports go and not be reliant as we are on trade with the United States, as well as we do supply some pretty sophisticated components, right? And they feel too reliant on that. So they want to diversify away from that, and they were headed in that direction. Our national security community felt exactly the same way because of our reliance on Chinese components for US weapon systems, right? So if you tore apart any sophisticated US weapon system and you saw how many parts came from China, you'd say, whoa, I don't like that, right? And with how tight supply chains are, if we ever went to war with China, they could shut down the production of some pretty sophisticated weapon systems in, you know, probably a week or week and a half.
Right.
So there was a move on the part of the United States, right, to decouple and diversify, and that was prior to all of this. And now I think the coronavirus crisis is just going to push that forward and make the need to do that even more clear and broaden the number of products, right, that we feel that way about, right? Pharmaceuticals being one of them. So I don't expect that companies will take the lead in doing this, because at the end of the day, companies created, right, these tight supply chains because they reduce costs, right?
Yep.
So I don't see companies doing this, but I see the government mandate, both governments, you know, mandating that certain supply chains have some significant diversification to them for national security purposes. I think we're heading in that direction.
Right. Yeah. You know, it's always nice to look for a positive in a crisis, and maybe one thing that'll happen is this will be the wake up call. I know there's a push, a lot more manufacturing is going on in Vietnam and Malaysia, and it's diversifying, but you know, to me, it's really, and we're going to cover a bit of this more in our panel later this afternoon, but there needs to be a large effort to bring a lot of kind of high tech semiconductor manufacturing back into our orbit, so we're not so reliant there. We only got a minute or a couple of minutes left. We have lots of questions rolling in from the audience out here, so I won't get all of them, but let me hit one of them, which is, you know, is what you can answer, obviously, on this one, but what role does CIA, or let's say the greater intelligence community, play during an event like this? I mean, kind of this biologic pandemic thing is never in my wheelhouse. I can tell you that.
So let me say what it's not first, right? It's not about monitoring outbreaks and predicting epidemics or predicting pandemics, right? That's the CDC's job. So the intelligence community's job is to monitor what governments are doing, what they're saying. Are they saying, is what they're saying publicly consistent with the facts that they know? Are they being transparent? Are they lying? You know, what are they doing more broadly? Who are they willing to work with? Those are the kind of questions for the intelligence community. But I think a lot of people, and I think there was some New York Times reporting that the intelligence community called the pandemic in early January, right? That, I don't believe that at all. It's not what the intelligence community does.
All right, very good. You know, we're just about out of time, so you know, maybe my last final question on a happy note. You know, besides obviously a wake-up call to the U.S., what do you see good that can kind of, and lessons learned that we can get out of a pandemic that you would give to any, you know, business owner, IT professional, you know?
Yeah, so I would say this. You know, this is yet another reminder of the American government, American society, American citizens in general, their general unwillingness to be proactive with the warnings that they receive from experts, right? So we've had experts for 20 years telling us that a pandemic is coming. It is absolutely guaranteed going to happen. We can't tell you when it's going to happen, and we can't tell you how severe it's going to be, but we're telling you it's going to happen, right? Over and over and over and over again. And the Bush administration had a strategy. The Obama administration had a strategy, but nobody was really prepared for in terms of mitigation, in terms of really doing the kind of micro monitoring that you would need to do to try to see what's coming at you earlier, and in terms of stockpiles of supplies that you would need in a pandemic, right? We didn't do that. And, you know, reminds me of 9/11, where, you know, for the 6, 7, 8 years before 9/11, the CIA and the FBI and the rest of the intelligence community was banging the table saying, this organization, Al Qaeda, and this guy named Osama bin Laden is coming after us, right? There's no doubt about it, coming after us. And we really didn't take action to defend the homeland, and we didn't take action to degrade Al Qaeda until after 9/11, right? So we wait, we don't listen. And so my great hope is that whether it's the U.S. government or it's CEOs and executive suites and boards, that they really start paying attention to warnings from experts and taking actions to mitigate those threats and to prepare for them should they occur, should mitigation fail, right? That becomes part of our DNA as a country. That's my great hope.
Right. I couldn't agree more. And there's so many corollaries to cybersecurity and continuity of operations. Maybe fortunately or unfortunately, there's so many cyber attacks every day. Companies have really woken up, and there's great products, you know, for disaster recovery, like Datto makes, and you know, who's here. So
it really took, right? I mean, it really took Target, right, at the end of the day for CEOs to wake up, right? And say, oh my God, I can lose my job over this. Right.
Yeah. It got real quick, huh?
Yep. Absolutely.
Well, Michael, I can't thank you enough. I know we went over a little bit, but I can't thank you enough for spending the time to chat with us and provide your insight, you know, big picture to us and the MSP community that's online here. So with that, I appreciate your time and thank you very much. And for the rest of the MSP community, got about 6 minutes left till the next session starts, and I will turn it back over to Ryan and Nicole.